Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm glad you could join me today from far and near. Today we're going to repeat this little subject and we'll have fun doing it. We've got a lot of techniques to learn in this particular one. Some of these slightly more advanced techniques take practice. So if you don't get it quite right today, please try it again because you really need to have these techniques in your pocket and have them handy when you need to use them. Okay, every time we paint something, we use a different range of watercolor techniques. So I'm trying to vary the subjects a lot so that you see how that can possibly work in all of the different types of things that you might want to paint. So let's go over to the table and start right away. Okay, so here we have Morro Rock, a local landmark. Oftentimes does look like this with mist on the top, where this is the original painting that you saw, that you signed up for. Very, very simple in the way that it's painted, but not quite so simple in the way the techniques are handled. So let's just watch for that, for the reflections particularly, and for the misty area particularly. And most of what we're doing when we paint relies on understanding not only the colors that we mix, but the amount of color and the amount of dark and the amount of light that we're using within those colors. And so this one is a good example of that. We have to be very aware of not getting too dark too soon with this painting. So just watch for those tonal values and make sure that you try to match what I'm showing you on the screen because that will help a lot. Okay, so here's our painting. We're working 5x7 in these little webinar skill builders. And because of that, this particular painting or this particular size gives you the opportunity to use this painting as a color study for a larger painting later on. And so that's the whole idea of this skill building exercise, that you can take it, you can enlarge it, and you can make a larger painting. Do remember that when you scale up, you need to scale up your brushes too. Little brushes like this will work as well on an 11x15 painting, except for detail. So you will need Kleenex tissues today for lifting, so we'll have those ready to go. Pretty much that's a given for watercolor, and pretty much it's a given to have a hairdryer not too far away, so you can just speed things up if you need to, okay? Now, when I make the copies of the subject for you, or when I make them for me, oftentimes I'll print them on plain paper like this, rather than photo paper. Can you see the difference between those two? So the photo paper is the reality of the photograph of this particular subject. But the reality of a photograph usually means that the dark areas are way too dark. So you have a choice. You can print it on regular copy paper, which helps you to see a little bit more information in here. Or you can print it on, or you can take it into your photo program and you can lighten it up a little bit before you print it. So this gives us a nice information about the shadow here, the reflection down here, but not so much information here. This one gives us more information up here in this area, if we look closely, and a little less information down here. But we can work much more easily with something that has more information in the subject. Okay, so just be aware of that. When you're printing, it's a good idea not to print on photo paper or not to take the photograph as it stands originally. If you were sitting in front of the rock in this particular situation, you would be able to see a lot more detail in this shadow area. Okay, so if you haven't painted much outside and you're relying heavily on photographs, just be aware that photographs aren't particularly truthful when it comes to shadows. Okay, they tend to exaggerate shadows and make them darker. So that's a good thing to know for all painting. Simple drawing today, not too much information, just a few little suggestions of shapes perhaps back here that I added to that drawing. Not really necessary to have those. I didn't use them in this painting, but I put them in here because I thought it might help to show you a little bit more as I go along. Okay, brushes that we're using today, number 10, number 8, and number 6. Are pretty standard. A flat brush is always useful for lifting, for correcting, so I usually keep that one handy too. We'll be using a little Frisket today, liquid latex, so hopefully you've got that handy as well. And to apply that, you can use brushes, synthetic brushes, or you could use the handle of a flat brush. And so I'm going to use the handle of the flat brush today. But if you are going to use a synthetic brush, you need to put a little soap on it first, like this, just a little dish soap or hand soap, it doesn't really matter, and then leave the soap on it as you use it. Then rinse it off in a different container of water. You don't want to use the same container that you're painting with. Don't want to get any of that latex onto your good watercolor brushes. Okay, so these guys work pretty well for applying that. But today, because it's just thin lines and that works really well with the brush, the end of the brush, and it's easier to clean up, I'm going to use this one. We're going to start with that right away before we even talk about colors, so that this has time to dry before we start to paint. Okay, so let's get that liquid latex out. Let's remember that we don't shake it. Think about James Bond, stirred, not shaken. And all we do is just stir it up with the end of the brush. And the reason for not shaking it is because in this painting, it won't make much difference. But in a larger painting with a larger area of this frisket, if you shake it, it'll have a lot of bubbles. And as it dries, those bubbles will open up into holes. And so you'll have to repeat the process. You'll have to paint it twice, once when it's wet and then fill in all the little holes afterwards. So just get used to the idea that you don't shake it, and then you won't have those problems. Okay, so we're going to dip this in here. Just make sure you don't have too much on the end of the brush, and use it on the back side like this. So I'm using it on the back edge, okay, to make lines like so. And we're going to make a few little white lines for the surf edges along here. A couple of them up against the rock to start with. And maybe another little one here, perhaps a little one on the corner here might be a good idea, and a couple of little ones there. Now do remember that these areas that you're marking off don't look very large until you take off the frisket, and then they look much bigger than they actually are. So make them really thin. This is a small painting. We don't want too many huge lines, and as they go back towards the rock, they get closer together. It's a perspective issue. And as they come forward, here for example, they get a little further apart. Can you see that difference? I'm going just a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing here. There we go. Okay, so you can see, and so we're just going to mark off the little edges of foam. And if you get areas that are too large as you're doing this, you can paint them down afterwards. It's not a big deal. Let's just make sure that we have a little bit coming across there and a little tiny bit coming across here. And this is the one that kind of goes down a little sideways here. So I'll put a little goodie in there. Loosen it up. It doesn't have to be too solid. Just a little touch. And you can spread it out. Just don't dig this tool into the paper. Let it slide across the top. It's easy to push it down too hard. You don't need to do that. It's not necessary. Right, just a few little lines. Take your time with this. There's no rush. Open these up just a little bit back here so they're not too solid, and that gives a little more impression of that wave. A couple of wave edges will be just a little bit thicker. This one here maybe, just a touch thicker, and some of them thinner. Just like anything else in life, variety is important. Okay. And that's about what we want to do. Don't put any down here. Don't save the little birds. On this one, I didn't paint the birds in. I painted a few rocks instead because it's such a tiny painting. If it were larger, I would put the birds in, but not on this one today. Okay, we'll leave those out because they can end up being just a little too large and a little too invasive on a small painting. So we'll put that back now. We're good to go on that. And I'll give you just a few minutes to finish that off before we move forward. Just remind you that you want your areas in water, whenever you're painting water, areas in water should appear to be flat. They can come in a diagonal direction, but they should overall appear to be horizontal, okay, pretty horizontal. And that's how water works in general. Just measuring here to make sure and we've got the water going back just a little bit further. The horizon line comes across here, but the rock angles back a little bit. And so our water line is going to change because of that. It'll go a little higher to the right. This is the little mountain in the background that's kind of hidden in the shadows that we'll put in later. Might just add a touch more while I'm waiting for you. Just a little tiny touch here. Pull that one down just a wee bit. Okay. All right. That should do it. You can actually get a lot of detail with the end of the brush like this and frisk it. I'm using a 1/4 inch brush here as opposed to the 1/2 inch, but both of them work very well for applying frisket. The idea of this angled end is actually for scraping. It's a tool to use for a technique in watercolor that we use quite often to lift out whites in a darker area. So this tool, you realize, of course, is saving the white paper for us. And so that makes it much, much easier for us to paint that whole front area, all of the water, without having to worry about painting around all the whites. And so it's a really good tool in some cases. Not such a good tool in other parts because it tends to leave very sharp edges. And so you have to be a little careful about where you use frisket. You wouldn't use it on an area that would be soft up here, for example, to try and save some of those areas. You wouldn't use frisket for that, or liquid latex for that. It's got all sorts of names. It's called Misket, Frisket, Resist, but it's all the same product. Okay, to take this off, so it looks like just about everybody's ready now. To take off your frisket, your liquid latex, we use a rubber cement pickup. If you don't have one of these, you just use your finger. Okay, so you take it off with your finger like this, or you use this just to lift it up. All right. Okay, so let's take a look now at the colors we'll be using. It's a pretty limited palette today, which is always good for paintings. Using fewer colors makes the colors work very well usually in a painting because it means the same colors are used throughout. And so it becomes more harmonious when you use a limited palette. So today we're using just 3 colors, both blues from the basic palette, ultramarine blue here, excuse me, and put a little bit of that over here so you know where it is. That's the warmer of the 2 blues. And Prussian over here, and that is the cooler of the 2 blues. That one is a little more like turquoise. Okay, not until you put them together that you can see a little bit more of the difference. Right? This is the warmer blue. This is the cooler blue. This one leans towards green. This one leans towards purple. If we had to say it leans in any direction. And the third color we're using is burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is almost a given for every landscape. You use it in so many different ways. So burnt sienna right here. And just to remind you that for burnt sienna and for raw sienna, those 2 earth tone colors that I use Winsor Newton brand, primarily because they're both very transparent in that brand. If you're using different brands, then you will find that won't happen quite so well, that the transparency won't be there. So you need to watch that. And if you change your paint manufacturers too often, that can cause some confusion because you won't get the same sort of color mixtures as you're used to. And so I stay with pretty much the same manufacturers throughout. Okay, so this is still wet, but that's not a problem because we can paint the sky even though the water's still wet. So let's just take a look and see what we're going to do here. So we have a large sky area that behind the sky appears to be blue. Okay, look at both photographs here so we can see both. So we have a blue sky back here, okay, and then we have gray clouds coming across here. We have a little white mist going over the rock. And we have these darker gray areas. There's a little land mass that goes through the back here. And so you can't see it terribly clearly, but we're going to put that in as a separate unit in the painting like this, like a little mountain back there. Okay. We're going to When we're painting, we're not necessarily copying and making it photorealistic. We're putting a lot of our own ideas in this. And this is a little bit of artistic license here to make that into more of a shape than it appears to be in the subject. Okay. And if you were there, you'd be able to see the outline of that. You can see it a little more clearly on this side. Okay. All right. So what we have to do is we have to start this idea of the mist over the rock in the very first part of the painting here. And so we're going to start by lifting some of that out from the sky as we paint. So because of that, we need to have tissues, Kleenex, ready, but not just dry. We're going to wet them today. And the reason we're going to wet them, so I'm just dipping them into my water and squeezing them out. The reason we're wetting them is because we want a soft edge on the outside of this. If we wanted a sharper edge on a cloud, for example, we would, I'm just pulling this over so it doesn't drip, we would use dry tissues. Okay, you can use a combination of both. And if you're interested in how clouds work and how you can paint clouds more easily, quite a few of the videos that I've done so far have skies with clouds. So you could take a look at that and practice those. So here we have these. Now, you want to be very careful that when you squeeze it out, right, it's not dripping. If it's dripping at all, then it's too wet. And I just had a little bit too much water in there, so I just squeezed it out and made it drier. So we're going to use this for lifting clouds out of the sky. So that needs to be ready to go before we start. So go ahead and make that happen. And then we'll be ready. And we're going to use a number 10 brush initially. And we'll mix up our colors before we start. Just looked at the colors so far, but let's see if we can mix those up now to work. The sky color it isn't really either one of the blues. It's kind of in between the two. So what we're going to do for the sky is to mix the two blues together. Mix a little Prussian with a little ultramarine. Okay. And as I do that, there's a touch more ultramarine in there. I can see that in my palette, that's way too dark. If I were to test that on a spare piece of paper, it would be way too dark. So to make it lighter, I need to add more water. More water allows the white paper to show through. And I'm going to need quite a bit more water to make this light enough. So let's just check that and see. And it's always a good idea to check. Now we're getting there. Now we're getting closer to the color that we see. Okay, I also use the tape here to check the colors because the tape is a light middle tone and it tells me how light or how dark my colors should be. Okay, do I want to be lighter or darker than the tape? In this case, I want to be lighter than the tape. Bearing in mind that this is going to dry a bit lighter, I still think it's just a little bit too dark. So I'm going to add a bit more water and make sure it's a bit lighter. That feels better. Okay, so I'm going to go with something like that. Now I've got one color in the sky, and that's the background color, which will be this one. And it could be a little more turquoise if you want it to be. It's a personal choice. If you want to go a little more in that direction, you can. This is a little warmer. Okay, if I wanted to make it a little more towards the turquoise, then I just add a touch more Prussian blue to it and balance the color that way. And we'll check again and make sure. So this one has just a little bit more turquoise in it. That's good. We'll go with that. Okay, so we have enough of that to cover the sky. That's important, that you have enough paint to cover the sky. So that's a nice big puddle will work. The next color that we need, that we're going to add on top of the sky, so we need to have it ready, is the gray, this blue gray. Can you see that? So we need to put that in with some of the other areas as we paint. So as we paint, we're going to lift out some of these in the painting, as you can see. And we're going to put in a little of the gray while the paint is still wet. Okay, we're going to lift out down here too. All right, so we've got a lot of things to think about in one wash. So the gray is made with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna together. If you put too much brown in, that's what you'll get, is brown. If you put a little less brown in and more blue, what you'll get is gray. So that's what we need. We need a nice blue-gray color. And how about the tone of that one? Does that need to be darker or lighter? It needs to be a little darker than the sky. So I'm just about there with that one, but I think I'll make it just a touch darker because it's going to dry lighter. I'm using a number 10 brush, just to remind you. Okay, let's try that again. Good, that's better. So now we have a grey that's going to hold its own. When you put that grey onto the wet sky, that's going to make a difference too, because it will get lighter, a little bit lighter. So we have to work fast. We have to prepare in watercolor, and then we have to paint very fast to make sure that the colors don't dry. It's pretty warm in here today. It's always pretty warm. And pretty warm means that everything dries very, very fast. Now we have the opportunity to wet the paper first, but I'm going to use the blue sky to wet the paper. So you'll have to watch, because I'm going to be working really fast. I'm going to be putting the sky on. I'm going to be lifting out the clouds. And then before the sky has a chance to dry, I'm going to be putting in some of this gray tone. Okay, so let's pull it down so you can see all of that happening. Actually, I'm going to go a little closer. I think you've got your picture, so let's just go a little closer so you can see what I'm doing a little more clearly. There we go. Okay, start with the sky color. And you can also add a little water into this too as you go, if you like. Now, looking at that, that's just a little dark. So I'm going to pull it down just a little bit with some water. It should be about this tone, okay, eventually. It's going to dry lighter. Now, it doesn't matter if some of this goes over the rock, but I'm going to keep it away from the rock as much as possible so I don't end up with too much blue on the rock. That might be too much of a problem, but it won't matter if a little bit goes over there. And it doesn't matter if it goes all the way down here and all the way down there. Okay, now it should be wet right now, okay? And if you were doing this as a larger painting, you're going to need a much, much bigger brush. Now I'm going to take my wet tissue and I'm going to lift out some of the mist on the top here. And the wet tissue generally gives you a softer edge, and you'll find this will bleed back just a little bit. And so we'll just take out some of that mist going across there. Take it across here. And a little bit over there, and just a little bit down here for interest. A bit more light mist coming out. Okay. All right, and now what I'm going to do is just line that up a little bit more, just open that up just a wee bit more. There we go. Now you'll find that that will bleed back just a little bit. I'm going to add the grey before this has a chance to dry, adding a little of that grey in there. If it's a little too wet as you add it in, then just put your brush on top of the sponge and soften it out a bit. So I'm getting a little grey effect across here, a little bit more here. Now I have to do this while the paint is dry. You can see this is not dry. This is just a little bit too dry, sorry, in this area. So I'm just going to soften that edge a little bit. Be very careful as you do this with your color, because if your sky is drying, you're going to get big blooms in there, and that's not what you want. And we want just a little bit of this gray over here, and this is dried already, so I've got to be careful just to soften that edge a little bit. Okay, so that's a good start to this painting. And all of these techniques that I'm teaching you take a little practice, and so if you're not getting it right, it's a good idea to go home and practice some more. I'm going to add in a little bit more grey on top here, just a touch to darken that area, and just soften the edge a wee bit. And now I'm going to stop, and now it's your turn. I have a slightly sharper edge here, so I can just soften that off a little bit with a damp brush. Don't really want sharp edges in here at all. So this is a practice, okay, and it's a lot of things to think about and a lot of things to do in one shot. So see what you can do. Start by putting the sky on, make it nice and wet. If it's not wet enough, it's going to dry very quickly, and then you won't have the opportunity of making that nice misty look. Okay, this misty area up here, we're going to soften back a little bit later, so don't worry too much about that. Okay, your turn. Put the sky on first, and before the sky has a chance to dry, lift off a little of the mist above the rock, and then add your grey in. Lift out a little mist around here too, and we also can add some grey later. We can add a glaze of a little bit more greyish if you need it later. Try and put a little grey on the left side and also a little on the right side, just a touch. Okay, looks like a lot of you are there. So I'm just going to move on to the next part of the painting. The next part of the painting is going to be the next largest area to cover. It's a really good idea to think in terms of painting the largest shapes, the middle shapes, and the smaller shapes in that order. And that way you cover the paper and you have an idea of how light or how dark the tones are working. If I were to paint the rock right now, I don't know how dark that rock needs to be in relation to the water, because our eye is comparing everything, one tone against another. And so I need to know that this rock is going to be darker eventually than this area of water. And this area of water is going to be lighter than the area below it, which is the reflection. So we're always trying to figure those things out along the way as we work. And so we're going to do the large wash in the foreground here, including the reflection in this next one. So again, it's a lot of stuff to do in one shot. So let's go back to the palette and take a look and see what we need to do. For these colors, we're going to need browns. Well, we figured out how to make browns already with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And that's basic. So if you are familiar with color mixing at all, that's a basic color that you can use. Here's our nice brown. Okay, a nice dark brown that we can use, maybe just a little bit more of that to make sure we have enough. It's always a good idea to make more paint than you think you will need. It's really difficult in the middle of a wash to go back and say, oh, I ran out and I need more. So always make a little more than you think you need. So there's a nice big dark brown for this area here. And this is just the beginning of this reflection. We'll be painting on top afterwards. We need a sort of lightish tone there. And a little bit of burnt sienna by itself will do for that. So I have that right there. This area here needs to be a variation of blues. So you can use some of the sky blue and you can use some of the blues separately for this. Or you can mix up a color. It doesn't really matter. It's up to you. You can make it a little more turquoise if you want to, or you can just use touches of both. It's going to be your choice, but it shouldn't be too dark. When we test these colors up here for the water, test them against the tape, that's about as dark as you need it to be for the water. Not too much darker than that. Let's make it just a touch lighter to make sure. And this one too, let's test that. Yes, that needs just a little bit more water in it. Okay. So I've got the sky color I can use. I've got those two colors. We have a gray that we can use if we need to. We won't need to use that just yet. We also have a little bit of sand showing through here. This actually is on the sand. The reflection's on the sand and the water stops about there. And so we always see a little bit of the sand color underneath. And that we can use a little burnt sienna for. So I'll just add a bit more burnt sienna. Make sure that's ready to go. Okay. Just think our way through the painting. Right, back to the painting now. We've got our colors ready to go. We've got blues ready to go, not too dark. We've got a dark brown. We've got some burnt sienna ready to go. We're going to be covering this whole area with lighter paint. Okay, we're going to pretend that this whole area is the same color all the way through to start with. This tone. The same tone rather than color, okay, the same tone. So we're going to keep fairly light on this one. Then before it has a chance to dry, just like we did up here, we're going to add in a soft-edged reflection down here. And we've got an idea of where that goes. It doesn't have to be exactly right, but basically it's a little darker here because of the shadow, and it's a little lighter here, and this is where we'll put the burnt sienna in this area. And a little burnt sienna in the water down here too. Okay, so that's the theory. So let's see if we can make that happen. I'm going to start with the sky color initially in here. And now the frisket is dry, we can just paint right over the top. And actually that sky color is pretty good right now. I think we'll go with that. And in a moment I'll add in just a little bit more of the blue into that and to come all the way down. And just before it has a chance to dry, I'm going to pop in a little bit of the Prussian blue in this area up here. Just a little bit. And a little bit more here. And that will give us just a bit more variation in that color. And down here, maybe just a touch down here too, just in those front areas. Okay, and now I'm going to go in with the dark brown. And the dark brown I know is going to come in here. I'm painting it back a little from the edge because it's going to bleed up to that edge. So I don't want it to go directly up to that edge just yet. So we're going to put this in. This gives us nice soft edges for that first part of the reflection. I'm going to go down there. It's going to come along the edge of the water here. And this is just the beginning. We'll add in the rest afterwards. A little bit of burnt sienna over here for the light side of the reflection. And a little bit of burnt sienna here on the sand, just to change that watercolor a little bit, and a touch more burnt sienna over here on this side, coming down right about here, just a little warmer. I'm going to go back with my dark brown and put some more in before it has a chance to dry. Okay, so this stops right about here, the dark stops right about there, and stops right about there, and it goes out just a little bit in a few places into the water, and that's okay to have that going on. So this is our first layer of reflection. I'm going to just put a little bit more blue in here to take away some of that reflection and make sure that stays where it belongs. Okay, and we've got a little sand color in here, and we've got the lighter water coming from the top there. We'll tighten up this edge later on. Okay, so your turn now. Work on the water, add a little more color to it. Start with the sky color and add a little more color to it as you go along. And then start to put in this reflection while the water is still wet. And I'll back off now and wait until you've done that. Most of the time, if you can paint wet and wet, or you can have colors mix on the paper, watercolors look much, much better when they're painted that way. Much, much better. And on the screen, you can probably see that I have a few little whites in here where my brush skipped over the surface. I'm tempted, and you would be tempted, to go back in with your brush and fix it. Don't do that. You can fix anything you want at the end of the painting. You're going to spoil your paintings if you go back in as the paint is drying and put a wet brush in there. You'll get a big bloom and it will drive you crazy because you want to do it, you want to fix it so badly, but sit on your hands and don't do that because you can do any fixings at the end. Okay, so I know that temptation. You want to avoid that one. It's always a good idea too to wipe the edges, especially on a larger painting. Just get into the habit of doing that. Great, everybody's getting that. That's good. Now, as you paint the next area, you just be careful not to put your arm on top of the paint that's drying already. What we're going to do with the next area is take that grey paint that we had for the sky, and we're going to put in just a little bit of that background mountain, just in here on the side of the painting. And we really don't want that to have a sharp edge, and so we'll take the brush. I'm using a number 8 brush now. Take the brush and just soften the edge off. Put the brush on your sponge before you try to soften the edge. Okay, rinse it in the water, put it on the sponge, and then we'll just soften that edge off so it becomes a softer feel up there. Okay, just a little bit of a softer edge. And let's do exactly the same on this side. Just a little bit of the grey in there, and then we'll soften the edge. And we'll soften that edge down. And this is the same grey that I used up here in the sky. Exactly the same. Darken it just a little bit down here towards the water. a little bit more colour on. There we go. And that should do it. I do want to have a slightly softer edge here. Part of that is my pencil line that I have there, so that's why it's not softening so well. On a larger painting that wouldn't make any difference, but in smaller paintings sometimes the pencil line can be a little bit invasive. Just a touch more dark down there, and we're good. Okay, that should be fine. All right, so now we have isolated our rock. That's the next job. Now you need to have your damp Kleenex ready for this next step because we're going to use it again. I just turned it inside out so I can use the other side because we're going to be lifting the mist off the rock as well as we paint it. So let's go back to our rock now. Back to our paint palette, I mean. And we'll look at some of the colors that we can make for the rock. The rock itself is not very colorful because of the lighting. It has a sort of grayish brown. And the color that we're looking for this first layer on the rock is this lighter color here, the lighter version of that gray brown. Okay, so we need quite a lot of water in the mix. So we can use the brown that we used down here in the reflection, and we can just add more water to it. We'll test it and see how it feels. That's about right. Just a little bit lighter than the tape is what we need. But that isn't going to be enough paint to paint the whole rock, and so I need to add more. So remind you that this is ultramarine blue and burnt sienna to get this mix. And it's a grayish brown. Okay, let's test again, test the color. And it's a grayish brown that we're looking for that is just going to be a little bit lighter than the tape when it dries. So make sure you have enough of that ready, and we're going to paint the whole rock in that color to start with. And every time we paint the rock now, we're going to lift out the mist at the top. So this will be the first layer, then we'll be putting a darker layer on top, and we'll be lifting out of that too. So this is the layer that will end up being the top layer on the side here, but the bottom layer on this side. Okay, so we're going to start by painting this all the way across. I'm thinking that might just be a little bit dead, and I'm going to add just a tiny touch more burnt sienna to it, just to liven it up a little bit. Well, that's about right now. Okay, so I'm going to paint this as though it was solid, right? All the way across here. And because this is the lightest color, eventually, I'm going to paint this side too. We don't want to leave any whites on this rock because the time of day would not show whites, and the whites would be too invasive. Whites are very powerful in watercolor. And so in some subjects, it's a really good idea to leave those whites. But in a subject that's moody like this, you don't want to see any bright, bright whites. So let's take a look at the top of the mountain. Let's see what it does up there. It goes up to there. And immediately, as soon as I put this on, I'm going to take it off right there and right here. Just a little bit, just a touch more water in there. It's just a little bit dry. There we go. Just a little bit of that mist over the top of the mountain. Right? So leave a little bit of the color showing, but not too much. Okay, so that's the first layer. Go ahead and do that and lift back the mist, and then we'll be working a little bit more on that. And don't worry if you don't get it all correct this time. We've got multiple layers to do on the rock, but you just don't want to have too much dark paint at the top of the rock right now. Number 8 brush, colors are burnt sienna and ultramarine blue for this grayish brown, about the same tone or just a little bit lighter than the tape for this first layer. And we will actually be lifting a little bit of this on the side here to make it a wee bit lighter later, but we don't want it to be white. Knowing how light and how dark your paints are is incredibly important, the tonal value of your paints and how you're getting there. So it's always a good idea to keep checking how dark and how light things are so that everything looks fresh when you've painted it, not looking overworked. Okay. And if you've done that and you're waiting, then we're going to be moving to a darker brown. And so that just means more paint and less water. So I'm going to move across here to the palette, knowing that some of you aren't quite done yet, just to mix up a darker version of that brown. Same puddle, more paint. This is not the darkest color yet. Okay, this is the dark middle tone is what we're looking for right now. And so that's going to be darker than the color we've used so far. And that's just a wee bit too dark, so I need to add a bit more water and make it just a little less. There we go. That's better. Okay, so just a little less dark. So it's darker than the tape now. Okay, the next color is darker than the tape, but not quite as dark as this one. That how much water and how much paint is very tricky, especially when you first start to paint. Okay, so we have our brown, and now this dark brown is going to give us an idea of the difference between this side and this side. Okay, and what we're working at right now is this sort of color. It's really not that dark. It will be much darker in here eventually. So I'm going to start with the idea that we're going to separate out just a little bit of this shadow on this side, okay, and just blotting my brush on the sponge to lighten it up just a little bit. Pull that color down and make it that sort of odd in and out shape that you see down there. Just a little bit more down there and a little bit more down there and there. So we're just starting to establish some of those tones. And coming around here, there's just a little bit more of that too. So we're isolating this light area here. And remember that everything in watercolor always dries lighter. So you're always wanting to paint just a little bit darker than the reality. You can see how this is already beginning to dry a bit lighter. And after you've got that side in, then we're going to be painting the front side again. Okay. All right, so you've got your dark brown, you've painted that little area in, and now we're going to paint the whole rock again, starting from the bottom. And it's much easier if you do this in steps. If there are some lighter areas in here, you can leave them lighter, but on the face of the rock, there won't be. But the reason we're doing this in steps is mostly because of the mist, because some areas are going to be lighter than others in the mist as well. And so we're going to go up to the top here, take a little bit of that dark in a few places into the mist, pull it down just a little bit more. Don't paint over the mist you've lifted already. And before that has a chance to dry, just lift out, soften and lift out that little area. Okay. Just going to put a little bit more in there, just a touch more color in there. And we're going to lift that back just a bit. So we're maintaining this idea of mist, but we're getting just a little bit of color within that misty area. Leave a few of the little lights there and then pull that colour way down to the bottom. Don't leave any hard edges at the top here. Lift those edges out so that everything at the top of the rock is looking misty. And bring that all the way down to the bottom. And we can have some sharp edges on the sides here, but no sharp edges on the top. Okay, the top should still look misty. And then while that's drying down, we're going to do a little bit more on the water. I'm just going to go back in and soften this right edge here, just so it flows down a little better into the rock. And soften it in here just a little bit too. Okay. Better not to get too dark too soon. Better to do it in multiple layers with a subject like this, so you keep control of where your color's going. It's very difficult to lose those shapes. Difficult when you lose those shapes. This is a good subject to paint on 300-pound paper as well. So if I were doing a very large painting of this, I'd probably choose to use 300-pound paper. The reason being that 300-pound paper stays wet longer, gives you a chance to work a little bit longer on the wet or the damp areas. 140-pound paper dries very fast, and so some subjects lend themselves to different surfaces, and this is one of them. Okay, now we're going to go down. We're going to leave that and let it dry down a bit. And it should have a variation right now. It shouldn't look completely flat, and it's starting to beginning to look a little rocky because we're establishing some lights and some darks and some sharper edges. Now we're going to go back to the water, and it doesn't matter if your watercolor bleeds into the rock a little bit at the bottom. And we're going to darken the water towards the back, but not towards the front here. Okay, just so you know, you can take a little bit of that color that you've used here and just isolate this front edge right up against here, and this is where you're going to keep that light edge, okay, across here. It's going to go all the way across there, right? So this light edge is not going anywhere. You don't want to put extra paint on that. You want to keep that pretty light right now, except for maybe just a few lines. Now you can see the separation once I sharpen that edge up a bit. And now we're going to take our watercolors, the colors that we used in the water, and make them just a touch stronger, a little bit more paint, a little less water, and start to put in some of these darker tones that we see back here, right up to the edge. Okay. Leave a few lights in a few places. Right in front of the rock, you will not see too many lights because it'll be in shadow. You'll just see the foam. You won't see the water being too light in this area here. This area here, it's going to be a bit darker. I've just added in now a little ultramarine blue. The first blue I put in was Prussian blue, and we're mixing the two together, okay, on the paper. So a little ultramarine in there, and a little Prussian, just a touch more color in the Prussian. Just the separate colors that we used before. Take some of those over, leave a little bit of the lighter tone showing, particularly as you come forward. And as you come forward, you get to about here, you're not going to go too much further forward than that at this point. Okay, and paint gets just a little bit lighter, just a touch lighter as you come forward to this area here. And I'm using horizontal strokes because this is water. Water always needs horizontal strokes to keep it laying flat. Okay, so just beef up the color is what we're doing really in the water. We're making it stronger. And a little darker. particularly towards the back, but not so much as you come forward. Right? Variation again. Vary the color just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. We can always add more, but we might not need to. Now, oftentimes this color in the water will appear to be too bright. Okay, and if that's the case, when it dries down or when it's finished, we can put a little glaze of gray over there. Or you can always gray down your colors with a little burnt sienna if you'd prefer the color not to be quite so bright. The reality of this subject is that there isn't a lot of bright light, and so therefore that usually affects how the colors look. I think these will be okay when they're dried down. And then while that's drying down, we're going to work just a little bit more down here on the reflection. But please leave that little strip light right now. That's part of what makes this subject interesting. It's the contrast. Okay, that's not a big job, so it shouldn't take too long to do that. And now we can take just a little bit of the blue, and I'm going to mix the two blues together for this. And we can establish this line that goes through here, this edge of the wave line that goes through there. And there's another one underneath. But we don't really want sharp lines. We want them to be soft. So immediately I'm going to take my brush and just soften that line down just a little bit. Okay, don't want those to be too strong. And that same dark line is then going to come under the edge here. Just a little bit, again, with a soft edge. And then I'm going to go over to the other side and do exactly the same thing. There's a little bit of an edge here and a little bit of an edge here that just needs to be softened. This actually can come all the way through. And we'll soften that edge down. Okay. Just so it's not too sharp. And I'm looking at the water here and seeing it's just a touch darker just at this point. So I'm going to put in a little of the blue and a little of the burnt sienna on top, just at that point. And soften the edge again. And the same thing happens on the right side here. It's just a little darker here, just a touch darker. You can just darken that down a wee bit. We've already softened the edge for that. We can soften it a little bit more as it comes up there. And just a touch darker on the edge of this one too, just above there, if you haven't already got that. Just little touches make a big difference to a little painting like this. Small touches of color. And now I'm going to mix a little bit of the blues with a touch of burnt sienna to gray them down just a wee bit. So I'm getting something like this that's just a little darker and a little grayer. And I'm going to put that along the front edge of this area here, just a little dark edge, so that when I take the frisket off, this is going to be like a little shadow underneath the foam along the edge there. And I'm going to choose a couple of other areas of frisket to shadow in the same way. Just as they come towards you is the best place to do that. Okay, that should do it. Just a couple of lines back there too. So we're getting a variety of tones in the water now, which is important. And if this dried out just a little light, you can revisit it and maybe make it just a touch darker. And again here too, just a little touch darker. And soften down the edges. There we go. Okay, now you can see from this photograph, once you've done that, that we need to darken the reflection just a little bit more before we finish in this water area, and then we're going to move back up to the rock and finish that off. So in the photograph, it's much, much darker. In the copy paper, it's lighter. We kind of want to go between the two. We don't want something too dark, and we don't want it too light either. But the center area of this reflection is darker because it's blocking the light. And so it gets lighter as it goes out to the edges. So let's just make that center part here. And this time I'm using lines, and I'm not going to soften the edges quite so much. I'm just using a suggestion of dark brown lines. So the dark brown is darker than the tape. Okay, right here you can see it's a sort of grayish brown. And I'm just going to break those up a little bit because that's kind of what happens in the foreground here. But I'm not going to do as much of that in a small painting as I would in a larger painting. It becomes too busy if you do that. Smaller paintings don't require quite as much detail as larger paintings. Okay, so that's good. Now in the center, I'm just going to link some of those lines together a little bit more. Okay, and on this side, I'm going to soften them off, and on this side too. So they go out into the water in a soft way, but not so much in the middle. Just soften this down a bit. And a few little suggestions of those blue waves down there too, if you want to. And relatively, this water here is just a little bit too light overall. So I'm just going to add in a little suggestion of dry brush in here. And dry brush is just when you're using your brush on its side, like this, the edge of the brush, and you're just pulling it across the surface to get a little bit of texture. And so you can use it entirely on its side or just sideways, a little bit like that, just to get a feeling of slightly darker tone and a little bit more of a horizontal water feel in there. Variation in that color. And on this side, it needs just a tiny little bit more color to make it more interesting. So just a little bit more of the burnt sienna over here will give us that light reflection on the side there. And just soften this down just a wee bit. And in a larger painting, I would make a little more interest in this foreground area, but in this little painting, it's not really that necessary to do that. That should be plenty. So it's a good idea that you realize that this tone here can't be too light. Okay, it can't be as light as this, for example. This needs to be varied just a little bit more, but it can't be as light as that. It has to be toned down just a bit more. If you want to put a bit more sand color in here, you can do that. And that helps to make it more interesting too. And that again is just brushed on, dry brush on just a little bit, just a touch over the water. And you can run a little water over that too. I'm just taking it down in tone just a wee bit more. So it has a little bit more interest in there. And it connects with this whole area going across. And you can leave this light here in the center if you want to, or you can just give it a tiny little bit of interest with some lines going across. But they should be very light, and they shouldn't be just a tiny touch darker than the paper that you've painted on, the color that you have on your paper. But it isn't necessary to have too much there. Lose a little bit of that light in there. Okay, so we're almost finished with the water now. We'll see, we might need to do a few other things when we take off the frisket. Now our big job is to make this rock look the way it should. So let's have some more of that dark, dark brown. And this time we're going much darker, less water and more paint. And we're using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna for that brown. It has a touch more blue in it to make it more of a grayed brown. And be careful not to put your hand over the front here. But let's start to establish some of those really strong darks in there now, shall we? And the idea of those darks, and if you look a little closely here, you can kind of see the diagonal movement of the rock as it comes down in these areas. It kind of points into the center, right? And so that's really what we're going to do now. We're going to establish some of these movements in here. And we'll probably do it in 2 or 3 tones. And we'll leave some of that color that we've got on showing, okay? Because it's not quite dark enough yet. So let's see. It's going to be darker at the bottom. And so we're thinking in terms of shapes coming down like this, okay, in that direction. And a little bit of dry brush, maybe a little bit of solid paint down here. Looking at the shape here, there's probably a shadow coming in there. And leaving a little bit of light on the outside. So let's just work at the bottom of the rock to start with. And we can move some of those up as we do that. I'm going to soften off just a little bit of this so it's not too sharp. Just with a damp brush. Let's move some of that color up. And as we get up into the mist area, we put this color on, but we also take it off again, just at the top there. Okay, so put some of this color on up here because it's a little darker, a bit scary, huh? But also take some of it off to make it more misty. Put a little of that color on there and put a little on here, but again, take it off to keep that misty feel, or soften it to keep that misty feel. And we want this bottom edge here to be particularly misty. So we can put a little extra color there and just soften it off so it has that misty feel. And you can't lose too much of the color in the rock. The rock itself has color, so if it's too white like this, it's not going to read correctly. So as soon as this has dried down a bit, I'm going to add a little bit more color up there to deal with that. But in the meantime, we're going to use some of this dark color, and we've just sort of suggested a little bit there to look at some of the shapes that we're seeing here on the edges. You see that shape as it goes in and out of this edge? So I'm going to see if I can capture some of that with this dark color. I'm looking at the shape going up here, and then going in, and then going up there. and just seeing if I can make that a little stronger. A bit stronger there, maybe a little bit stronger there, put in there. On this top edge, it's darker, and it comes down here. Use a little bit of light. So just for strokes to separate out some of those shadows in there. Pretty much everything. I see another one up there that I'm going to have to blot a little bit. And I see one coming, a zigzag sort of shape coming in here. That goes like that. And it goes down into that area. And now we're getting something that looks really rocky, which is good. And one reason it looks really rocky is because of the sharp edges that you're using. Okay, and that's important to know that rocks have sharp edges. Okay, on the back here, there's a little one of those. And in these areas, this edge is not sharp, and so we have to soften it. Okay. This edge is not so sharp either, so we have to soften it down here. And the edges down here are not quite so sharp. So we're just adding in a little bit more detail, a few marks with the brush to make that idea of rocks. Particularly at the bottom of the rock, there will always be a little dark area as it hits the water. It's always going to be a little darker along there. That just a little bit too much into the water. And we'll soften the top edge of that little area that goes into the water. Okay. All right, so this is just a bit flat right now. So take a little bit of that colour and lighten it a wee bit. And we can just finish off this side to separate that light area out. And we can add in just a few little suggestions. Now, if your area isn't light enough, you can lift it back, so you can just wet it like this. This is actually light enough, but you can wet it and you can use a dry tissue or Kleenex just to lift out a little bit of that light space. So if you want it to be brighter, you can do that. And you can have just a few little brighter rocks in here by lifting out some of that light. If you had left it as white paper, they would be jumping out like crazy right now and not fitting in with the rest of the painting. And so that's why we didn't leave that white paper here. There we go. That's plenty light enough for this side of the painting. Now I'm just going to accent a few of the little shadow areas on this side. Just a few little touches. Looking at the shapes that I'm seeing here and putting in some little tones where I see the shape just a bit darker. And these little brush accents act as shadows against the rocks, and they're quite effective. Okay, I'm going to leave that pretty soft for the moment. Not going to put too much detail on there, but I am going to soften this edge just a bit. Edges are key to painting. Edges are the way that we read paintings. If you have a sharp edge in your painting, a light against a dark with a sharp edge, your eye is going to go to that part of the painting first, always. And so anywhere that you don't want the viewer to look first, you have to adjust the edges. And the edges can be soft or sharp. And soft edges in art are called lost edges, and sharp edges are called found edges. And so in your paintings, you want a variety of lost and found edges. Lost edges where you want the eye to flow over, and found edges where you want the eye to stop. Okay? So a lot of the edges in here are lost because they're connected with tones that are similar. So painting is like telling a story. You decide as the artist where the viewer looks first and what part of the story the viewer is understanding at any time. by the way that you paint it. You have the power to do that. Okay, a little bit of soft here just to lift back some of those areas. Lift back a little bit of light tone in a few places, just in these areas on the edge of the rock. And we don't have to do a lot of detail here to make it read rocky. It reads pretty well right now with just a few odd brush strokes. And that's the beauty of watercolor. Watercolor suggests better than it describes. And so if you can suggest a few little goodies, then that's the way to go. Okay, now I'm going to add a little bit more tone here because where I look, I see the top of the mountain just a little bit more in this area. So I'm going to add some more tone, and then I'm going to soften it down. That's too dark, right? So I'm going to soften it down by lifting it just a little bit. So each time I lift now, I'm lifting just a little less of that mist. This is too light here, so this needs a little tone too, just a little bit. And I'm going to soften it with the brush on this one. Okay, just make sure there's enough color in there so that we can see a misty outline of the rock. You need to be able to see that misty outline. Use your tissue, go back and forth with your tissue so that you can just pick out small areas of that. And over here I'm going to have some more mist, so I'm going to lift back just a little bit of paint. Just have a little bit more mist coming over that area. And it's too even right now. It doesn't fit with the rock. So when that dries down a bit, we're going to paint in some rocky shapes up there. And it's just a little bit too sharp-edged right there. There we go. Okay. I'm going to add in some of my grey paint. So while we're working around the rock, I'm going to add in just a little more of the grey that I used in the sky, because this dried just a little bit lighter than I would have liked here. I put a little bit across here and let it bleed into that area, and just a little bit across here too. And of course that's going to be way too hard edged, so we have to soften that off and make sure it feels like it's a sort of misty grey area. So back down here we can have just a little bit more of that grey mist going across with a soft edge. We'll just let it drift up. And at the same time, I'm going to use my flat brush just to soften the edges of the mist in the sky just a wee bit. Flat brush is really good for loosening up and softening edges. Okay, looks like I might have some colour on there, some yellow on there. Just get rid of that. There we go. So I'm just softening up a little of the mist, the edges of the mist here. Make sure they're not too sharp. If they're too sharp, they look more like clouds. So that's the reason I'm doing this, because I really want it to look more misty and less cloud-like. And I'll put a little grey in with that mist too. A little grey coming into here, because mist usually isn't completely white like a cloud. It's just a little greyish. There, now it's beginning to feel more misty. So you can adjust and you can change, you can do all sorts of things once the paint is dry. Okay, don't try to do anything while the paint is still wet. Okay, so I'm running a little grey into that misty area and just softening the edges so it feels just a little bit more misty. And then I'm going to pull just a touch more out of here so it feels just a little more misty there too. And then I'm going to put some sharper tones up into and against that mist. Okay, I think we're ready now for the strong darks. So we're not quite done with the mist yet. We'll get that. Any other areas you want to be misty, you can lift out too. That's a possibility at this stage. This looks misty, but I think it could use a little grey. It feels more cloud-like than misty, so I'm just going to add a little grey in there. And soften the edge. And that turns it into something that feels just a little bit more like mist and less like cloud. So all of these adjustments that I'm doing can be done very easily on dry paper. Very easily. We'll just soften that into the side there. Make sure that connects, it doesn't have a gap. It feels right now like it's got a gap in between. There we go. And just play a little with the edges, the softening and the lifting and the idea. Okay, and now we're ready for our really strong darks in the rock. And so really strong darks are darker than this, actually. So to make darks, you need to have your paint very wet. So if you're not keeping your paint sprayed constantly with your spray bottle, so the surface is wet, you're going to have the hardest time making darks. I can make dark instantly because this paint feels as though it just came from the tube because it's so wet. Okay, so if you're painting with dry paints, let them dry out when you're not painting, but all the while you're painting, you should be keeping them wet. If you're painting with really dry paints, you're going to have the hardest time making darks. You'll just be wearing out your brushes. So really important. Now, the dark should flow. It shouldn't be sticky. Okay, it should have enough water in. And let's just check and see if this is a really strong dark. That looks about right. And it's not until you add the darks, the true darks, to your painting that the painting really comes alive. Okay, this is kind of okay with the rock, but it needs some more darks in here. It needs a suggestion of a darker tone in here. It needs a suggestion of a darker tone there. And here I'm doing just a few darker shadow lines within the rock. I'm not going to make everything dark, but I am going to take some of this up to the edge here to give it interest on that edge. I'm going to take a little bit in here to make that more interesting. And I'm definitely going to take some more down to the bottom. Pretty much all the way along. And just push it up into the rock a little bit. Up here. And generally, when I'm painting, I don't normally paint from just one photograph. So it's always good to have more than one source material. For something like this, we can do that easily. I'm just using a separate brush now, a number 6 brush, just to soften off some of these areas that I've put in here in a few places, because I don't want strong shapes and strong edges everywhere in this dark area. But I think you're getting the idea of how this rock works. It has this flat feel to the front, and so I'm using my brush to make that flat feel across the front there. And the areas right by the ocean here are going to be very dark too. So you can take that all the way across, except where you've got the frisket, which you will take off afterwards. You can take that all the way across and just soften that area up into the rock. Let's make sure we don't have anything that reads like a line, like a strong line. There's a very strong shadow here that has a shape, and the top of it has a soft edge. And I'm looking at this shadow right here when I'm talking about that. There's a strong shadow that goes there with a sharp edge, and then it softens off just a little bit up there. So I'm always looking at these edges to see how I can make the rocks and this type of subject more interesting to look at. A little bit more dark in there, touch more dark over there. Not too many darks on the light side, okay? Just keep it away from the light side. Just a little bit more dark up there. And now there are actually some shadows that we can see up in the mist. So I'm going to add a little bit of this shadow in here, right up against the edge of the rock. And I can see another shadow there. And this is in the misty area. So in a moment, I'm going to soften those down just a little bit more. And this needs to be softened down a bit more. And this color needs to come up into the mist, just a little bit more in this place. So just a damp brush to pull the color up into the mist. Make sure you've got some of those edges just a little sharper. So it's kind of an adjustment. We're doing a little adjustment here just to get a feeling of rock that is there, but it's only there very lightly in the mist area. Right? And now we're going to use the damp tissue again to pull out some of those little areas. There we go. So we get that feeling of mist going across the top. Maybe just a little bit further across, over to here too. So it's not feeling like a cloud sitting on the top there. There we go. Okay, still working with the darks and making sure you have enough shapes in here. And just go back and forth and just adjust and add in just a few more little shapes in that misty area. Just blot a little bit less. So we've still got some definition even up in the mist, just a little bit of definition of the subject. Just pull that down just a bit. And I'm going to put a little bit of mist over the side here too by lifting the damp brush and just pulling out a little bit of that shape there. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to lose the total shape of the subject. So you've got to go back and you've got to keep putting in just a little suggestion of that shape that's in there. Now we'll let that dry down just a wee bit and see if we need to do more to that. What I do need to do is to add a little more to the shapes as they come up into the mist. So it's a little bit of a shadow there, a little bit more of a shadow there. And just put that little edge back in again. So some places you see just a little more shadow than others, and some places the edge has gone completely. Kind of a little balancing act here as to how much mist you want sitting on that rock. Okay, do you want it to come down here too? Perhaps you could have a little bit down here too. But we still have to have a little bit of a shape inside the mist. And so it's a little balancing act as to how much you take out and how much you put in. It's kind of a back and forth. And this one here could be just a little misty as it comes in on the side. That needs to go lift back just a little bit. So you just go back and forth until you're comfortable with how that works. Now the outside edge of this particular hill, because of the fact that it's on the shadow side, is just a little softer. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to go from the outside and just soften that edge down just a little bit with a damp brush. So it's not quite such a sharp area. Just a little softer. And you can use your tissue on that too if you want to, just to soften it up a touch. Just a little bit too much shape there. Okay. All right, so this little area here just needs a few more suggestions of tone. This could be lifted just a little bit more. It's a wee bit too dark. So I'm always adjusting little tones here, little tones there to make it read correctly. On a subject like this, it's a little tricky balance to see how much light, how much dark. You can have a softer edge here too, a misty edge there as well. A little feeling of that. Just a little softer mist feel over the center there. There we go. And we're just about done with that misty part for the moment. Just a little bit more dark in there. And so it's the shapes that you're looking at. When you're changing these misty areas, you're looking at the shapes and saying, well, does that still read like the top of the rock? And does it still have a kind of an indication of maybe that there's a little shadow in that area? And so you're trying to maintain some of that as well as making a misty shape. So it is a little tricky to get that we're all working together. But I think we'll stop there for the moment. I'm just going to soften the edges of this just a little bit, and then we'll go down to our water and take off the frisket and see what we need to do there. So I'm just opening up this edge a little bit more to allow a little bit more light through in a few places, and getting rid of this line. Can you see how that's a line down there? It really shouldn't be a line, it should be a tone rather than a line. So let's just loosen that up a bit. Make sure that works well. And maybe just pop in another little dark in here, perhaps, just on that edge, and that little dark, and make that little dark better. That seems to work pretty well there. Just a little bit of dark across there. Okay. All right, so now that we've finished that, we're ready to take off the frisket. Make sure that your paint down at the water area is dry before you do that. If it isn't, I'm just going to use the hairdryer just to make sure that that's dry. If it isn't, you need to just dry off. Now be careful when you use the hairdryer with frisket, because you can cook it into the paper if you're not really careful. And be sure you don't use frisket and put it outside to dry, because the sun will cook it into the paper for you too. So let's just see what we can do here with this, just to dry it off a little bit. I guess we're not working here on that one. Well, we won't worry about that. We'll just use the pickup and take it off anyway. Okay, let's take this off. And when you take this off, it's always going to be very, very bright, very light, very invasive. And so we've got to calm it down just a wee bit. So I'm going to go almost up to the bottom edge and leave that bottom edge for the moment, because it's not quite dry yet. Don't want to smudge it too much. Okay, so now we've taken this off, we can see some edges that are maybe just a little too bright, too sharp, too the wrong shape there. They just didn't work as well. This little area here, for example, needs to be calmed down a bit. Let's go a bit closer for this detail so you can see where you're going there. Right, so this little area here can have just a little bit more information underneath, and that works. This little area here, these waves are too wide for being so far back, so we'll just make them a little bit narrower. Just a few touches of corrections to these, and if the whole thing feels as though it's too big and too wide, just cut it back a little bit like this with a little paint, a little blue paint, and that will calm it down and make it go where it belongs. And that is one of the disadvantages of frisket. It always has very sharp edges. it always ends up being far too important, because white paper in watercolor is very, very strong and very eye-grabbing. Okay, so that's pretty good. Don't watch for the really strong straight lines like this, and just break them up a little bit so they're not completely across the painting. And I have a few more little goodies here, and for some reason my hairdryer isn't working, so we'll just wait for a minute or two for that to dry up enough so I can lift off those little areas. I think this one might be okay over here. Take that off. And those little areas next to the rock are going to jump out even more, and so you're going to have to calm those down just a little bit more, because it's the contrast between the light and the dark that is a problem there. Just take that out. So we'll just calm those down with a little bit more blue paint. Just tiny touches is all you need back there. Little tiny touches of wave and spray. Don't need too much. Okay, take this one off now. And this is way too big, so this needs to be cut down to maybe 2 sections. Maybe that smaller one there, and that larger one there, and that will read a little better. Let's go across and see if there's any more. Just get sitting there. A little bit more there. And just a touch up here. I didn't get off yet. Usually you can feel with your finger if you've missed any. That's about all of it, I think. So this one just needs to go down just a little bit more. It's not quite so strong. And in the background, they're not really bright white either. They're sort of a light blue, so you can just put a little grey-blue colour over the top of some of these if you want to, in the area close to the rock. If you have too many lines like this, you can lose one of them just by painting it out, and that works pretty well too. And I'm going to darken this little edge a little bit more underneath here, and just soften it off into the water area to make a little shadow. And take a look from a distance and see how much of that light you really want to see in your painting. Is it reading correctly, or do you have too much? If you have too much, paint it down. Just get rid of it. Just paint it over. Take a look at the grey mountains in the background. Is that something you'd like to change? Do you like them the way they are? Would you like them to be just a little darker? Feels to me like these could be just a little bit darker. So I'm going to put a darker tone here and then fade it off as it gets towards the top. So this is adjusting the tones of the painting, and it's not until you've got all of your tones in that you can see whether you need to do that or not. Okay, so it's really important to know that you can go back and finish off all these little edges when you're done. This little area of the rock is in shadow and it feels a bit too light, so I'm just going to put a tone over the top of that to calm it down a bit. Soften that edge a bit more too. If you want more mist, you can lift out more mist. If you want less mist, you can paint in just a little bit more. This is probably okay. I'm just going to put a little bit of tone here, just a little shadow up there, just to kind of indicate that that's going into the mist. And I think I'll just pull out a little bit more mist on this corner, right there, with the damp brush, the flat brush. Just a little bit more of that feeling of mist going in there. And use the wet Kleenex just to extend it out a bit. So we kind of go back and forth with that whole idea. Right? On the right-hand side here, this feels a little fractured in my painting. In the subject, it feels just a little bit more of the same tone all the way across. So to make that a little less important and to connect everything together, just going to run a lighter tone over the top here. I did take some of that off, and I probably took off just a bit too much. So let's just run a lighter tone across there, just to connect everything together a bit more in that area. Okay, these shapes are pretty good. They're pretty accurate for the rock. There's a couple more shapes that come in on the side here that you can put in if you want to, but it's pretty close to the feeling of this particular rock. And we don't have to be that detailed, and it's more about the tones than it is about the individual cracks and fissures in the rocks in this particular painting. We've got a feeling that we have those cracks in the rocks going down the front by leaving some of those lighter browns in there. That works pretty well. And I think we're going to say that's just about it. If you need to put any more lines in here because you didn't get quite dark enough, you can. If you want a little relief in there, if it feels like it's too solid, then you can take your flat brush and you can lift out just a little bit of tone in this area. Now when you lift it out, it's going to be too light, so you'll just run a little blue over the top of it. So you can bring out a little feeling of wave coming across there, like that. This is just with the flat, damp brush. And that lifts up and gives a little more interest in that area. So just the things that you might want to change. And now I'm just going to run a little blue color over that, a little of the watercolor over that, so it's not completely bright. And that gives a better effect in that area. Gives it a looser, more watery effect. I don't see too many light lines over here, but if you wanted to add a couple of little lighter lines here, you could do that also. You can also do it by, you can also lift up your area here with lighter lines if you want to. Maybe just a little touch here, a few little lighter areas going out there. But don't overdo it, but it is possible to take out as well as put in paint. And oftentimes I take out more than I put in because it makes it work better. So let's just paint right to the edges. And I think we're just about done with this one. So I'm going to take the tape off, see how that looks. And I've shown you a lot of things that you can do to correct, a lot of things you can do to change. You can still keep working on this painting if you want to. You can still correct or add to the misty feel up here. You can add a little bit more gray to the sky if you wanted to. Make it feel like it's a little duller back there. The only thing that I'm looking at with mine when I take off the tape, and that changes things too, is that I think it needs to be a little grayer down here. So I'm going to put in a little bit more gray and soften that edge right away and just give it more of that feeling of gray in that area. And that seems to help. It seems to take away that bright white area that I had there. That didn't feel like mist, it felt like cloud. So you want to make it feel just a little bit more like mist. Okay, so let me come back and check with you again and make sure that you're okay. I hope you've enjoyed that lesson. There's a lot to learn in a subject like this. It's a really good idea to do it more than once. Try it over, try practicing some of those techniques. Try them on a separate piece of paper too. But when you're working in situ like this, it's much easier to do a technique like this. So check it out and see if you can make that happen in other subjects. Okay, so I will look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.